Okay, so you think McDonald's is the biggest fast food chain on the planet. It isn't. Not for most of the last 2 decades. For over 10 years, the largest restaurant chain on Earth by physical footprint wasn't selling burgers. It wasn't selling fries. It was selling 6-inch and foot-long sandwiches out of narrow storefronts with no drive-thru, no fryer, and no grill. By 2010, Subway had quietly passed McDonald's in global store count. It eventually peaked at nearly 44,000 locations spread across more than 100 countries. McDonald's at its own peak topped out somewhere around 40,000. Here's what makes that even stranger. A single McDonald's typically pulls in between $2.7 and $3.5 million a year. A single Subway pulls in somewhere between 400,000 and 490,000. Subway built more restaurants than anyone else alive, while each individual one of them did roughly a sixth of the business a McDonald's does. McDonald's, underneath the burgers, is quietly one of the largest real estate landlords on the planet. It owns or controls the ground its restaurants sit on and profits from that land, whether the fries sell well or not. Subway never owned a single piece of real estate anywhere in its network. Every franchisee signed their own lease, carried their own liability, and shouldered their own risk from day one. Two of the most recognizable logos on Earth, built on almost completely opposite financial foundations. So, here's the mystery. If Subway built the single largest restaurant network in human history, why have more than 8,300 of its American locations vanished since 2016? Why do you keep seeing that same headline? Another Subway closing? Another dark storefront in a strip mall that used to be busy? The answer isn't a story about bad sandwiches. It's a story about what happens when a company discovers a way to grow that has almost nothing to do with selling food and everything to do with selling the right to sell food. Did Subway become too successful for its own good? Stick around, because the answer says a lot more about business than it does about sandwiches. Here's the assumption almost everyone walks in with. Subway makes money when you buy a sandwich. Technically, sure. But that's not where the real money actually lives. Subway's real business is licensing. Every store owner pays $15,000 just to open the doors under that name. Then, every single week, forever, they hand over 8% of gross sales in royalties, plus another 4.5% into a national advertising fund. Add it up, and headquarters is taking 12.5 cents out of every dollar that crosses the counter before rent, before payroll, before a single onion gets sliced. Now remember what I just said about that 12.5%. It's calculated off gross sales, not net profit, which means a store owner can be losing money that week, and corporate still gets paid in full, on time, no exceptions. Run it through a real example. A location doing $10,000 in weekly sales sends $1,250 straight to headquarters and the marketing fund. It doesn't matter if that store's rent went up. It doesn't matter if a competitor opened across the street. That check clears regardless. That's the entire conflict sitting underneath this brand, and it's the thread that runs through everything else in this video. Subway headquarters wants more stores generating more total transactions across the whole system. A franchisee wants their one specific store to be as profitable as possible. Those two goals sound almost identical from the outside. On the inside, they are not the same goal at all. And the gap between them is where this story actually lives. So how did a sandwich chain out-expand every burger giant on the planet using a fraction of the capital? Simple. It never needed a kitchen. A standard burger franchise needs a grease trap, a gas line, a commercial exhaust hood, and a building constructed specifically to hold all of it. That kind of real estate is expensive to find and expensive to build, often running past $1 million to $2.2 million before a single employee is hired. Subway skipped almost all of it. Pre-baked bread, cold prep stations, a small convection or toaster oven, no open flame, no grease, no fryer. That single design choice is the entire reason Subway could fit into places no burger chain ever could reach. Gas stations, hospital lobbies, college dining halls, airport terminals, even the leftover corner of a Walmart. Any spare 300 to 1,200 square feet of retail space became a potential Subway, because the plumbing, electrical, and mechanical demands were low enough to plug straight into whatever infrastructure was already sitting there. And here's where it gets interesting. When your barrier to entry is a few hundred square feet instead of a standalone building with its own parking lot, you don't expand restaurant by restaurant, the slow and expensive way. You expand like a virus, filling in every gap the bigger chains physically couldn't reach. Think about what that means for a real estate team hunting for the next location. A burger chain scout is searching for a rare, expensive parcel zoned for drive-through traffic. A Subway scout is searching for empty retail square footage, full stop, which exists everywhere. all the time in every city on the planet. That difference alone explains most of the gap between 40,000 locations and 44,000. Sounds like the safest expansion strategy in fast food history. Well, almost. Subway didn't spend billions building 44,000 restaurants. It spent almost nothing. Instead, it convinced tens of thousands of individual entrepreneurs to spend their own savings doing it for the company instead. A new franchisee needed somewhere between $199,000 and $536,000 in total capital. The franchise fee, the build-out, the equipment, the lease deposit, the first few months of payroll. All of it funded personally. All of it at personal financial risk. This company was built by a 17-year-old. Fred DeLuca wanted to pay for college, so a family friend named Peter Buck, a nuclear physicist, lent him $1,000 to open a submarine sandwich shop in Bridgeport, Connecticut back in 1965. It was called Pete's Super Submarines. The plan the two of them scribbled out was to open 32 locations in 10 years and call it a success. They blew past that number almost immediately, and somewhere in that early expansion, the real business model revealed itself. It was never really about the sandwiches. It was about how cheaply and quickly the concept could be replicated using someone else's money instead of their own. Here's the problem with that model once it scales to tens of thousands of units. Subway itself carried almost no exposure. Zero capital invested per store, zero lease liability, zero risk if a location failed. To push growth even faster, the company built a network of regional recruiters called development agents, who earned roughly a third of every royalty dollar generated inside their assigned territory, on top of a direct bonus for every new store they helped open. Think carefully about what that actually incentivizes. These regional operators got paid more every single time whenever a new Subway opened nearby, whether or not that new location made any economic sense for the owners who already had one. Say a single Subway location does $10,000 a week in sales. At a 10% margin, that's $1,000 in weekly profit for the owner and $1,250 in royalties for corporate. Now a second Subway opens half a mile away. Combined sales across both stores climb to $12,000 a week. Corporate's cut rises right along with it, up to $1,500. A 20% gain for headquarters, and for the development agent collecting a third of it. But the customers didn't multiply. They split. Store A's revenue drops to $6,500. Store B opens the door with $5,500. Rent didn't go down for either of them. Staffing didn't go down. And now both owners are quietly operating at a loss, propping up a corporate royalty stream that just went up because of them. This is cannibalization, and Subway became the textbook case of it across the industry. In dense cities, franchisees would look out their own front window and see another Subway sign glowing across the street. Same logo, same menu, competing for the exact same lunch rush, sometimes owned by the same regional operator who approved the second location in the first place. Corporate wins when total system sales go up. Owners lose when their own store's slice of that total shrinks. Same expansion. Two completely different outcomes depending on which side of the royalty check you're standing on. By the mid-2010s, saturation like this had become one of the most common complaints inside the entire franchisee community. Not competition from outside brands, but competition from their own logo, approved by the very system that was supposed to be protecting their investment. Subway marketed itself as the affordable way into business ownership, and compared to a McDonald's, it genuinely was. Liquid capital requirements as low as $40,000 pulled in thousands of first-time owners who could never have qualified for a bigger, more expensive chain. But cheap to enter doesn't mean cheap to survive. Run the full math on an average location doing $450,000 a year. Corporate takes its 12.5% off the top, $56,250, gone before anything else is paid. Ingredients eat roughly 30% of revenue. Labor eats another 30%. Rent, utilities, insurance, and maintenance chew through most of what's left over. What actually lands in the owner's pocket after every single one of those deductions? Somewhere around $22,500 a year. That's the entire annual reward for the risk, the personal debt, and the 7-day work weeks that came before it. And here's the trap. That margin has almost no cushion built into it. A 5% jump in food costs stacked on top of a 5% jump in wages doesn't just dent the annual profit. It erases the entire thing completely in a single bad year. Compare that to what happens on the corporate side during that exact same bad year. Ingredient inflation and wage inflation don't touch Subway's 12.5% cut at all, because that number is locked to gross sales, not to what's left over after costs. The owner absorbs 100% of the volatility. Corporate absorbs none of it. That's not a coincidence built into the contract. That's the entire design of the contract. Subway was never a destination. Nobody plans a special trip across town for a sandwich the way they might for a steakhouse or a favorite bakery. It's a convenience purchase, made by someone who's already moving through the world. An office worker on a lunch break, a student between classes, a commuter killing 10 minutes before a train, which means store revenue is basically a function of one thing. How many people happen to walk past that specific door on any given day, chomp that traffic pattern even slightly, and the entire model breaks. An office tower that goes half empty because of hybrid work doesn't gradually hurt the subway on its ground floor. It guts that location almost overnight, while the lease obligation attached to the space stays exactly the same size it always was. Enclosed shopping malls carry the same risk from a different angle. Steady foot traffic for decades, then a slow secular decline in mall visits that no single store owner has any power to reverse. If you're finding this breakdown of Subway's business genuinely useful, do the channel a quick favor. Hit subscribe and drop a like. It really does help. In 2008, in the middle of a financial crisis, a Miami franchisee tried something simple to fill empty weekend tables: a foot-long sandwich for $5 flat. Corporate loved the results so much they turned it into a national campaign almost overnight, and it became one of the most successful fast food promotions in American advertising history. Sounds great. Here's the catch: once customers learn a foot-long costs exactly $5, that number gets permanently stuck in their head. Back in 2008, with food costs low, a $5 footlong left the franchisee with a little over $1 in profit after corporate took its cut. But through the early 2010s, wholesale prices for beef, pork, and cheese climbed steadily, and rising minimum wage laws pushed labor costs up right alongside them. Total cost per sandwich crept past $4.50. After corporate collected its fixed 63 cents regardless, the franchisee was now losing 13 cents on every single promotional footlong they sold. Corporate still wanted the volume, because volume meant royalty income no matter who was actually profitable on the ground. Franchises wanted out because they were quite literally paying customers to eat there. The fight over one $5 promotion turned into lawsuits, public franchisee revolts, and years of the ugliest internal friction in the brand's history. All triggered by the single most successful marketing idea the company ever had. Watching a subway line move might be the most underrated piece of operational engineering in fast food. Bread and protein selection first, toasting and cheese next, then an entire glass case of vegetables the customer controls personally, one topping at a time. Sauce, wrap, payment. No grilling required at any point in that sequence. No open flame. No line cook standing over a hot surface trying to time 6 orders at once. That simplicity is the entire point. New hires can be trained in a matter of days instead of weeks, which matters enormously in an industry built on constant staff turnover. Ingredients arrive pre-portioned and pre-chilled, so assembly during a lunch rush looks closer to a factory line than a traditional kitchen. And because the customer is the one physically choosing every single topping, they feel like they're getting something built specifically for them. At a marginal cost to the store of a few extra slices of vegetable, it's one of the cheapest forms of personalization ever engineered into a restaurant concept, and it let a tiny footprint move a genuinely large volume of customers through a narrow, brutal, once-a-day lunchtime window. Compare that to a burger chain, where every custom order slows down a grill that's already running at capacity during the rush. Subway's line never really stops moving, because the customer is doing part of the labor themselves, one topping request at a time, without even realizing it. While burger chains spent the 90s getting hammered for being greasy and heavy, Subway built an entire identity around the opposite idea. Eat fresh wasn't just a slogan. It was the smell of baking bread pushed toward the sidewalk and a wall of visible vegetables arranged directly behind the counter, engineered to make health-conscious customers feel like they were choosing something meaningfully better for themselves. For over a decade, that positioning drove real, measurable market share, but perception and reality started drifting apart. In 2020, Ireland's Supreme Court ruled on a tax dispute involving Bookfinders Limited, a Galway-based Subway franchisee, examining exactly how much sugar was baked into the company's bread. Irish law exempts basic staple bread from sales tax, provided sugar content stays under 2% of the flour's weight. Subway's bread came in around 10% of the flour's weight, 5 times the legal limit. The court's conclusion was blunt and unambiguous. Legally speaking, that bread wasn't bread at all. It was confectionery. So how does a brand built entirely on the word fresh end up legally reclassified as a dessert in a national court? The uncomfortable answer is that brand positioning and nutritional reality were never actually required to match each other. They only needed to feel true for long enough to shape a decade of daily customer habits. By the time the court ruling made headlines, millions of customers had already built Subway equals healthy into their weekly routine, and a single legal technicality about sugar percentages was never going to undo that. Through the 2010s, a new wave of fast casual competitors started eating directly into Subway's territory. Jersey Mike's, Firehouse Subs, Jimmy John's, all offering fresher-feeling ingredients, fresh sliced meats, and noticeably more modern stores. Subway's decor and menu, largely frozen in place for years, suddenly looked dated sitting next to them. At the same time, digital ordering and third-party delivery apps exploded across the industry, and a decentralized network of thousands of independent owners struggled to modernize anywhere near the pace of a centrally run competitor. But the deeper wound was internal. And it's the part of this story that rarely makes headlines. Those same development agents who recruited new franchisees were also responsible for their monthly compliance inspections. And in many documented cases, those same agents personally owned competing Subway locations inside the very territory they were inspecting. The conflict of interest speaks for itself. Franchises repeatedly accused inspectors of citing trivial, almost invented infractions, a smudge on a counter, a slightly misplaced ingredient bin, specifically to push independent owners into default. Once a store was forced out of compliance, the agent or an ally close to them could acquire that established, already profitable location at a steep discount. The scale of the resulting disputes shows up plainly in the legal record. In 2017 alone, Subway initiated 702 arbitration actions against its own franchisees. McDonald's, that exact same year, initiated exactly one. Multiply 702 arbitration filings across a single year, and picture what that actually looked like from the inside. Franchisees hiring lawyers to defend a sandwich shop over a smudge on a countertop, some of them losing locations they'd spent a decade building, watching a competitor with the same logo take over the lease within weeks. That's not a rounding error in a franchise system. That's a structural feature of one. Keep that number in mind the next time a franchise agreement looks like a safe, proven system on paper. The brand name was never the risk here. The people managing the brand on the ground very often were, by 2019, with store counts falling and franchisee trust badly damaged, Subway brought in a new CEO, John Chidsey, specifically to force a system-wide turnaround before the decline became permanent. The fixes were expensive, slow, and exactly the kind of overhaul a company this size structurally struggles to execute quickly. A menu relaunch called the Subway Series simplified ordering into numbered, pre-designed combinations to speed up the line and raise the average check. An $80 million capital investment installed real deli slicers in over 20,000 stores, replacing pre-sliced meat with something that at least looked and felt freshly cut in front of the customer. Corporate began actively pushing single-store owners to sell out to larger, better capitalized multi-unit operators who could actually afford to remodel and modernize their locations properly. None of this happened quickly, and none of it came cheap. But it worked well enough to stop the bleeding, restore some franchisee confidence, and quietly set the stage for something much bigger to come. Same-store sales, which had been sliding for years, finally started climbing again. Proof that the underlying brand still had real demand behind it once the operational rot was cleaned up. Running tens of thousands of stores does buy real, tangible advantages. Subway's purchasing cooperative negotiates lower prices on flour, meat, cheese, and packaging than any independent sandwich shop could ever hope to secure on its own. That pooled 4.5% marketing fund adds up to a national advertising budget most regional competitors simply cannot match, dollar for dollar. But scale cuts both ways, and this is the trade-off almost nobody talks about. The same size that gives Subway its buying power also makes it painfully slow to change. Rolling out deli slicers to 20,000 independently owned stores took years of planning and $80 million in capital, when a single independent sandwich shop could have made and executed that same decision over a single weekend. Bigger doesn't just mean stronger. It also means slower, heavier, and considerably harder to steer once the market shifts underneath it. A small 3-store local chain can change its bread supplier on a phone call. Subway needs vendor contracts, regulatory checks, and buy-in from tens of thousands of independent owners before a single ingredient changes anywhere in the system. Scale is a genuine advantage right up until the moment the market moves faster than the organization can turn. No single event explains the collapse in Subway's American footprint. It was a pileup of smaller pressures, all landing at roughly the same time. The U.S. location count peaked around 27,100 stores in 2015, right at the height of internal cannibalization and self-competition. By 2021, that number had fallen to 22,190, hit hard by pandemic-era traffic collapses in office districts and downtown cores. By 2023, it was down to 20,133. By 2024, 19,502. By 2025, 18,733. Over 8,300 locations gone in under a decade. An entire mid-sized restaurant chain's worth of stores simply erased from the map. This wasn't corporate losing control of the brand. In a lot of ways, it was corporate finally admitting an uncomfortable truth. That 27,000 thin margin, closely packed storefronts had degraded the brand's reputation and profitability far more than they'd ever grown it, and that fewer, stronger, better located stores would generate healthier average sales for everyone still standing. The same expansion machine that built Subway into the largest restaurant chain on the planet turned out to be the exact same machine that eventually forced it to shrink. Let's run both versions of this story side by side, the way you'd want to before signing anything. The optimistic version. You buy into a globally recognized name, keep total capital under $200,000 if you're efficient about the build-out, land somewhere in a 5 to 7% net margin on decent volume, and pay the whole thing back in roughly 6 to 8 years if absolutely nothing goes wrong along the way. The realistic version. A competing Subway opens 2 blocks away, a national promotion locks your pricing below your actual cost of goods, or the office building next door quietly goes half empty and never fully recovers. Any single one of those can flip a thin, hard-earned profit into a real annual loss, and in a genuinely bad year, the swing between a good year and a bad one can run past $20,000 for a single small operator with no corporate safety net underneath them. That gap between the story printed on the franchise brochure and the story sitting quietly on the store's actual bank statement is the entire lesson of this video. It's not that Subway is a scam, because it isn't. Thousands of owners have made a genuinely good living inside this system. It's that the same 12.5% royalty, the same development agent incentives, and the same razor-thin margins that built the largest restaurant chain in the world are exactly what made so many of its individual locations so fragile. In August of 2023, Subway agreed to sell to the private equity firm Roark Capital for roughly $9.6 billion, a deal that closed in May of 2024 after regulators spent months scrutinizing exactly how much of the American fast food sandwich market a single owner would now control, given Roark's existing ownership of Jimmy John's, Arby's, and McAllister's Deli. Subway didn't become a giant because it made the best sandwiches on the market. It became a giant because it perfected one of the most scalable franchise systems ever built. A system that turned thousands of individual dreams of small business ownership into a single, enormous engine of royalty income, and then spent the next decade slowly discovering the limits of that very same success. Before you go, there's a much deeper, more detailed breakdown of exactly how deals, franchise math, and business models like this one actually work in practice, sitting in the description and pinned right at the top of the comments. Genuinely worth a look if you want to go further than any single video can take you. And if this kind of breakdown is something you enjoy, subscribing and liking honestly helps this channel keep making them. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.